Okay, we're live. Welcome back to the Hill of Roses, where we come once again to celebrate the best contributors to our independent policy movement for progress to bring power to the people. With me today, we have Ihssane Leckey. She is a candidate from Massachusetts 4th District. Ihssane, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you for having me, John. Thanks for hosting.
You're very welcome. So, on the program, we traditionally talk about policy and strategy as our main bread and butter. But before we get into that, we'd love to get to know you a little bit more as a person. Are you still working while you've been on the campaign trail? I know a lot of our working class individuals running have had to do that. And if not, what were you doing beforehand?
I was a Wall Street regulator. I worked at the Federal Reserve as the special examiner to hold accountable the biggest banks and their greedy CEOs and make sure they're not gambling with our economy again. So part of that job is to have the back of the people at 100%. And it's a job where you must be politically disengaged, keep it neutral. And so I could not do this work and keep my job as a regulator.
That makes sense. Yeah, I know for myself, I'm working kind of as a financial consultant, so I've had to work with a lot of those companies. And I know I had a similar relationship when I was briefly running in the fall. I have to ask you, in that capacity, what inspired you to take the leap from regulator and trying to help the people make sure they're protected there to taking the transition into running for office?
Well, I mean, with the Trump administration especially, they basically shredded the program that I was working on. It was part of the Dodd-Frank, but it was a program that actually looked at risks that our economy could be facing in the future and assessed how can we prepare for those risks, how can we mitigate them, and how can we actually hold these big banks accountable and make them put aside rainy day money instead of putting their hands in our public money as bailouts. And so, of course, Trump and his followers from Wall Street would hate such a program. Banks do not like to put money aside. They want to invest everything. They want to take risks. And a lot of the times, they actually want to gamble. And they want to go into things that aren't healthy for our economy. But furthermore, the fight doesn't just stop in regulating the big banks. The fight is systemic. And what I saw as an immigrant who came here as a 20-year-old, I dived headfirst into poverty. I realized that the promise of the American dream was not afforded to just anyone. You had to have the money, you had to have the connections, you had to have the big name. And those are things that I honestly associated with the country that I came from rather than America, the country of freedom and of human rights. But I also, realized that in that struggle of taking sub-minimum wage jobs, of struggling with healthcare inaccessibility and housing insecurity and student debts and all of that, I realized that struggle was a struggle of millions in our country.
Yeah.
And that we, the people who have gone through it, hold a moral responsibility to step up and to fight for that American dream, where we have an economy where we are truly participants, where we can actually benefit from the crops of our hard work, where we can have healthcare as a human right, housing as a human right, education as a human right, no matter the zip code, and where we can actually center racial justice in every step of the way, because the history that of our country here isn't told the same way in our schools and isn't told the same way across the world. I do come here. When I came here, I did not know much about the history of racism and of slavery. And it is really past time that we address these issues and stop running away from our problems and solve them together.
Yeah, I have to ask, I think the heart of what you were getting at was a lack of economic mobility caused by a variety of issues that have cost inflated, not keeping up with the wages that we're all expecting as a country. In your opinion, also being a regulator yourself, so seeing some of the groups that have been frankly gouging us, what has caused this lack of, frankly, accessibility to most Americans to be able to live, as you said, the American dream?
Well, I mean, a lot of it is, if you look at who has the power in our country, our country has this promise of having a government that fights for the people. But what we ended up with is a government that fights for the corporate CEOs. And that's because those same corporate CEOs either get into our government through a revolving door, and also into our regulatory agencies. And they also, they finance those campaigns for who they want to elect, right? They find people who are going to agree with them, who at the negotiation table with unions, they're going to side with the corporations, with the developers, right? With the private hospitals, with the private prisons. And that's where we really need to start. That's where we need to address these issues, to completely remove the influence of the corporate world on our government and create a people's government instead of a corporate government.
So, you brought up, I would say, 5 main issues here, and I'd love to dive into those just a little bit better. You had brought up the idea of housing, of healthcare, of, democracy reform and a bought government, racial justice, basic tenets of rights. Can you go into a little bit more of what those look like? Let's start with healthcare. What type of a universal healthcare program are you trying to champion in your campaign? I saw a single payer. Is it the same type of program as Medicare for All?
That's right. I have been a fighter for Medicare for All since before I launched my campaign, May of last year. I was really, what actually drove me to fight for Medicare for All was personal lived experiences. I lost my father when I was 13 years old because we couldn't afford his medication. And when I came to this country, I was in a car accident on a job. And the first thing I asked for is, please do not call the ambulance, because I was too afraid of deportation. I was too afraid of the medical bills that would follow. And, those things really opened up my eyes. But as you know, Medicare for All goes further than that. Medicare for All also includes our bodily rights as women and as a people who want to have abortion as a human right, to secure that human right. I'm a survivor of an illegal abortion in Morocco, and I know what it's like to be in the dark rooms, not knowing if you're going to actually survive that procedure. And I know that millions of people actually go through that here in America, where they're denied that basic human right. So that fight, that part of the fight in Medicare for All, is also very, very important to me. But other things that you're asking about, I know you had mentioned, housing, etc. So for housing, again, a lot of what I fight for is really driven by personal lived experiences, having lived in homes where I had, had mice. It was not a livable situation. I didn't have heat. My landlord, I didn't even know what he looked like. And I was even asked to make sure that I have somebody who's a co-signer for me to rent, because I didn't have a credit history, right? We talk about people who don't have a good credit score. I didn't even have a credit history as an immigrant. And so I was denied even opening a bank account. So the whole system truly works against you when you're new here. And it makes it really hard for you to get that head start. And that's why when I say that I am fighting for the most vulnerable in our communities, we have to really meet with people and listen to their stories and listen to their struggle to inform the policy making and to dig deeper into who are the most vulnerable amongst us, right? And that's what I've been doing in my district, is having those conversations to inform the policy making and to inform my platform, because I know even with my own personal lived experiences, there I do have blind spots. No one can be everything,
Yeah.
and I really I'm keen on surrounding myself by people who bring more perspective and to help me see better.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful approach. I think not only on a improving policy level, but as a coalition building strategy, being able to bring more people into the fold and feel like they have a voice and representation in the actual policy drafting process is really important. I wanted to just ask two clarifying questions on the subject of Medicare for All first. Currently, it's a very popular proposal when it comes to the voters. It ranges from anywhere between high 50s to even 71%. And when you go specifically to Democratic voters, it's around 76%. But when you look at the composition of Congress today, we're roughly 100 people off in terms of the House, in terms of co-sponsors needed to be able to push this through, and 46 people in the Senate. What do you think those people are missing, and how can we potentially be communicating better so that it gets adopted by even more individuals?
I think that the individuals in our government are well informed on these numbers. I think what they're not informed on is how are we going to make sure that we have a just transition for labor, for example?
Yeah.
How are we going to make sure that we have this single payer system that cuts costs on the way our healthcare system is right now, and that actually provides people access to preventative care, so that we're not ending up in the emergency room over and over, that we're actually catching illnesses early on with less complications, and that we have a streamlined system where we don't have to be on the call with the health insurance company for hours. Many of us have experienced that. So we really need to have a government that can be proactive in every step of the way, including in our healthcare. I think that the influence, again, of the pharmaceutical corporations, of the private hospitals, I think that influence, as a Wall Street regulator, I've seen it reside into the portfolios of the big banks. I've seen the struggle that the Federal Reserve went through when we tried so hard to regulate the insurance companies. And I understand deeply that the power of the corporate interest in our government is something that we need to address head on.
So I have to ask, clarifying that reform to actually have that influence come out. I think a very popular notion that I know you've also supported is repealing, Citizens United. However, that is an initiative that could potentially either be challenged in the courts if we just draft legislation, or we're going to need a constitutional amendment to achieve that. What are some other methods that you think we can do just through a legislative process that would help improve that situation? I know we passed the For the People Act last year, but we had that end up stall in the Senate. What do you think we can do tangibly to start breaking that stranglehold that corporations have?
Well, we can have more candidates who commit to not taking that dirty money. I don't take corporate PAC money, and I don't take corporate lobbyist money, and I don't take dirty developer money, and the list goes on. And that's because I was actually trained through my work as a Wall Street regulator to be very keen on understanding what is a conflict of interest. And a little story is that I had a mortgage, and the mortgage company that I got the mortgage from sold my mortgage to one of the banks that we were regulating. And so I had to, first of all, I was trained to declare that to my employer, to the Federal Reserve, to let them know. And second, they asked that I actually get out of that mortgage and go find another bank that I don't have an interest, that I couldn't have a conflict of interest with. But that has been built in the system of regulating Wall Street. And I am just baffled that our government doesn't have these same rules. And so one of the things that I would actually address is to redefine what is a conflict of interest when you are a congressperson. And that's number one. Number two is we gotta close that revolving door between Wall Street, regulatory agencies, and our government, White House and Congress. And so until we do that, it's going to be very challenging. And this is where organizing matters. You know, as an organizer who's been on the ground, shouting for, and Citizens United, shouting for, demanding Medicare for all, a Green New Deal, etc. I know the power of organizing. What we see right now in our streets for Black Lives Matter is an empowering example of the effects that people's organizing can have on their governments from the local to the state to the federal level. And then we find those same organizers and we make them into our representatives. And that's why organizing and electoral must be hand in hand.
So I wanted to clarify that conflict of interest item, because I think we've seen this past year when we were going through the coronavirus, some of these scandals arise, especially with the idea of insider trading. It's a little bit of a conflict of interest to be able to trade on inside intel of the development of this disease, be able to make transactions on your profile for personal gain. But we didn't see any necessary enforcement of these standards. So do you think that we need to actually add some additional enforcement measures in addition to redefining what conflict of interest is?
Can you repeat your question in terms of COVID, you mean?
No, just in general. I think one of the things is it's great to have a law. I think that's very important to define what is misconduct, but to actually be able to apply that where there are penalties according to that law. Because I think right now we have not seen any resignations of the 4 members of Congress. On a bipartisan level, there was not just Republicans, but Democrats as well, who are trading on inside intelligence that we were going to face a potential crash because of COVID. How do you think going forward we can better enforce laws on the book in addition to redefining how we define, a conflict of interest?
Well, I think those people should be forced to resign and should be prosecuted for what they've done. I mean, if you see on Wall Street, why we shouldn't be treating people who are in Congress any different from everyday individuals, and they should be upheld to the same set of laws so that we can have some more respect for public service in this country.
Okay, so I want to now transition away from just the policies to actually how do we get these things done? Because I think a lot of the current composition of Congress, we can agree, is not exactly the progressives like yourself at this exact moment. We maybe have a dozen in total that we would consider progressives who are championing the exact same causes right now. We would love to have a full sea change this year, but we've seen from some of the primary results, we'll be able to add potentially some, but not all. What can we do when we have this composition where we're not in the majority yet to be able to still drive change towards our causes? What would you try and do in your leadership style to be able to start getting some of these, PowerPoints unlocked for us to be able to get the full agenda accomplished later on?
As Congresswoman, I will make sure that, my focus in my district is that organizing is coupled with policy. Is that I'm having roundtables in every town of my districts. I have 34 beautiful towns and cities. Majority of them are low income. The few minority are some of the richest, wealthiest towns in the country. And so we need to start there. We need to actually see why is it that our organizing does not span out into the towns that have been neglected for so long, that do not have public transportation to get into, into the movement building in downtown. We're talking about suburban towns. Why is it that we, a lot of times in our movement building, we see that most of us don't come from the backgrounds and from the hurt and pain of what people on the ground are actually going through. Because if somebody is a parent, they can't meet you at 7 p.m. If somebody is working 3 jobs, they can't commit to a lot in the movement. So we need to bring our movements and our organizing into the people's comfort, and prioritizing their voices and including them as much as they can be available into our movement building. And so that's, to me, public service is really about digging deeper in community and coming to people where they are, so that we can build together in our roundtables and reflect their needs into the policy making. I think we've had across the country some stellar candidates who ran amazing campaigns, but we always doubt people at the beginning, and that's why we don't win. It's because for a long time, we've asked people to come out from their, from the lived experiences, right?
Mhm.
We've asked them to come out, but what kind of supportive system have we created in our progressive movement to support them and take them on from day one, instead of asking them to be on the phones fundraising for most of their daily hours? These people are much better having their faces and their mouths and their hands, talking to people, shaking hands, speaking truth to power. And that's how we need to empower them. Our movement should be much more invested in these candidates, so that we make sure that they actually win these seats.
So what would that look like? I understand the empowerment and having this big coalition and getting into the field, but I'm wondering what can be done from the existing progressive caucus to be able to support those efforts. What do you think are some things that the progressive movement in general has not been doing a great job yet, but can be doing a better job with someone like yourself incorporated into Congress?
Well, we need to have more conversations. We need to be inclusive. We need to, again, really support people who come with the lived experiences, and who have limited themselves to not taking this corporate interest money, so that we can help them build the movement campaigns that they're building on the ground. I think that it's important for us that we not only look at what our politicians can do. We have to look at what our movement organizers can do. And I personally have been blessed with so many movements joining the campaign, including Mass Peace Action, including our local progressive Needham, including JVP, If Not Now, Matriarch, BNC. People are stepping in and really. No, they understand that fundamentally what it comes down to is the ability to build trust in the community, and that is what we need right now as we're fighting for our democracy and our basic human rights.
Yeah, I think that definitely makes a lot of sense. I now want to transition to asking some questions that I know the community really cares about here at the Hill of Roses. The first is, a policy question. Are you in favor of a universal basic income, whether temporary during the coronavirus crisis or permanently going forward?
I mean, that is the pragmatic solution to the crisis that we're in, is to have at least $2,000 for each individual for at least the duration of the crisis, plus 6 months, if not a year. And I'll tell you what, these ideas of universal basic income, especially throughout the COVID-19 crisis, aren't just so-called lefty ideas. And I wanted our viewers here to understand this. This is not just being a cool lefty. This is actually about saving our basic human rights to food, to shelter, to healthcare, and to save our economy from a total wreck. Every debt that you have, every rent that you pay, every mortgage that you pay, it doesn't stop there.
Yeah.
There's a ripple effect in the economy, And that ripple effect, unfortunately, because the way our economy is structured, is that it has these giant players that hold so much risk. And then there is everybody else. So what happens is that when everybody else fails to pay those basic debts and that basic rent, or even to consume, just to go to your corner store or your, your favorite restaurant or whatever you like to do, when you stop consumption, those big players get hit by a big shock and they fail. And then when they fail, they take down everybody. The people lose their jobs, lose their health care, lose their livelihood. And our government, again, repeatedly writes out blank checks to the big players and leaves people to basically die, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why the basic income during COVID and post COVID is something that is, first of all, just going to help us stay afloat for a little while. But unfortunately, it's already becoming too late. It's already becoming too late, because it's just the way these things work are, even if they start sending checks to people, the jobs aren't going to be available right away, which is why we need, in addition to the checks, a massive green recovery plan and a massive Wall Street reform that would stop us from writing these big checks of our public money to the big players.
Yeah, I certainly love that approach for how we're handling COVID. I would just like to clarify, would you support the idea in perpetuity? I know you had mentioned here in 6 months to potentially a year, but do you support the idea of universal basic income during non-crisis moments as well?
Well, we have to create millions of jobs, and we have to give people their right to healthcare, and we have to cancel student debt, and we have to cancel medical debt, and we have to build millions of housing, of affordable housing units, and we have to have a tenants' rights that are at the federal level, including rent control. We have to make sure that we have schools at every zip code that actually give our children an educational future. And when we do all these things, we might not need this idea of the UBI anymore. We might not even think that we need anything like that, because the need of it right now is because we're denied those rights, right? That we need something immediate to make up for that gap, because our income level has been frozen and the cost of living is skyrocketing. So we need systemic change. I do support UBI, but not as the solution. UBI by itself isn't going to solve our systemic racism problems and all these other issues that I just listed.
So I have to ask, though, obviously you said it doesn't solve it by itself, but when you compare it to each one of those items that you had mentioned, why does that not be a part of the total solution? For example, the cancellations of debt. If you had a universal basic income, you can utilize that money to be able to pay off your debt, while those that did not have debt are still benefiting from the universal program. It's a form of not means testing it so that everyone's getting it. Why can't that be incorporated as a solution as well as all the other ones that you had mentioned?
I mean, it can be incorporated jointly as we roll out these other problems. But what we've been seeing with our government is that there's a lot of patchwork. And I would tell you now, if there is a universal basic income, it better be universal. And when I say universal, I want every human being who's breathing in this country, who's needs to actually be able to get that, right? But and our viewers, I think they're very informed on this, is that every negotiation stops at the immigrants who's got documentation, who's a resident, who's not. And look at what's happening right now, even just with international students, right? International students with COVID have been suffering from homelessness because the dorms have closed and they don't have anywhere to go, right? and they don't have permits to actually work, right? To be your delivery person when you order that sandwich.
Yeah.
They don't have a permit. And so how are we going to actually start treating human beings as human beings and not as a GDP number? How are we going to actually start to think about being this country that is promoter of peace and of human rights at its fundamental, and take that into the policy making? So no, it's we're not here for half measures. The time for half measures has come and gone. We're for bold structural change.
Okay, I hear you. I would disagree on it not being part of structural change, but let me move on to the second and last
I
part.
did not say it would not be part of structural change. What I said is that it will be needed as we make the structural change, but whether it's going to be needed afterwards, I'm not there to answer that yet.
Okay, let me go to the last and final question that I have for you. So, you know, we support here a combination of representative as well as direct democracy. I'm curious, in your opinion, if you support measures like a national referendum. You know, we have these measures on state levels currently in many states around the country. I'm curious if that's something that you'd be willing to consider on a national level.
Can you clarify a referendum for what? I
If you have
couldn't
a
hear
variety
you.
of different policies, it's a national annual referendum, something that would come on your ballot every year come election time, where you, the individual citizen of this country, get to be a voter on that issue.
Which issue? I missed what you said. I'm sorry.
It's the idea of just a national annual referendum. The idea of every cycle, the people get to vote on said policy on a national level.
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Okay, well, I love the bluntness of that. So we're approaching the end of our time. I'm so thankful for you to spend the time that you did with us today. For the people who enjoyed hearing what you had to say today, how can they be able to help and support your campaign as you are approaching, I think it's come July that you have your primary? Do you mind informing us of the primary date as well as how people can help?
Sure. Our primary date is September 1st.
Oh, you have a late one. Okay.
Yep. And it's all about the primary in our district. This is a so-called safe blue seat, but it's not a safe people seat. It's a safe corporate seat. That's how it's been historically. So we're looking to make history in District 4, turning it from a district that represents big corporate checks, into a district that represents the working class in a district, especially folks in Fall River, folks in Taunton, and in many, many other cities and towns in the districts who have struggled for a long time. You can help by volunteering. We make calls. We make a lot of calls. It's COVID time. I'm not out there, we're not knocking on doors, unfortunately, not yet. We want the safety of our constituents and of our volunteers to be first. But we are organizing through Zoom meetings and town halls. We are organizing when we're called on to show up at Black Lives Matter protests and share the personal experience, especially as the only woman of color running in this race. I'm blessed to bring that perspective and be able to share with the community how important it is to have representation. On my website, ihssane.org, IHSSANE.org. You can also donate. And I really look forward to building this movement with you as we're getting close to September 1st. We can win this. We can win this. I have faith. We will.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being here today. And if you're looking for how to be able to spell that, we have that currently scrolling across the bottom of our page. So we do hope that you will come out and be able to support. I know these are some difficult times to be able to donate, but if you can't do that, as she just mentioned, time is a valuable resource, and she'll be needing that, especially since so much of our campaigning now is mobile. So I hope you will consider that. Again, that's ihssane.org. So please, everyone, consider going there. So thank you so much for your time today. Rosebuds, thank you so much as well. Last thing I want to mention to you all is a programming note. We'll be back here again at 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. We'll be speaking with the Green Party presidential and vice presidential candidates. So we look forward to having that conversation with them, and we hope that you are all there. As always, my friends, I hope you are staying safe out there. And as always, I hope you stay rosy.
Thank you so